Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to my 2021 deck collection. Today we're going to be taking a quick peek at all the Oracle decks currently in my collection. While this is in no way an extensive review of these decks, we'll chat briefly about how I use them in my personal reading practice. To start things off, we're going to be looking at the Oracle decks that I use in my personal practice for growth, healing, magic, and deep inner work. The first deck in this collection is my Mother Mary Oracle. This is not only a deck that kind of represents my coming back into reacquaintance with Mother Mary, but it's also what I call my bedtime deck, because at night I pull one card from this deck and it kind of serves as sort of a nightly sort of prayer or devotional. Gives me something to kind of focus on and think about before I drift off to sleep. Another deck is the dream reading cards. So this is a deck that I use very much in its system format. So when I have a dream that I want to explore more, I will look up the images from my dream and kind of read more about it, journal more about it, dive a little bit deeper into dream interpretation, and that's been really fun. It's not something I do daily, but it's definitely something that has become a part of my practice on occasion, particularly when I have dreams that feel very meaningful. Next up, we have the Messages from the Light meditation deck. This is a deck that I do actually use for meditation works. I use this deck for a lot of other things as well. I also use it in readings. I use it to complement tarot. Sometimes I use it to just key into a mindful message for the moment. But I do primarily use it as an anchor point for my meditations. And so it's definitely one that gets used quite frequently. The next deck is the Goddess Oracle. Now this is also a deck that I will work with whenever I just need to connect to goddess energy. I really enjoy the artwork in this deck. The guidebook is amazing and I really enjoy that as well. And this was a deck prior to me getting my Mysteries of Mary. It was my primary deck for the full moon. And it's also the deck that kind of kick-started my diving deeper into goddess work in general. So another goddess deck that I often work with is the Goddess Knowledge cards. I tend to pull this deck more often when I'm doing deeper goddess work, deeper goddess readings. I did use this deck primarily on the dark or new moon before I got the Dark Goddesses Tarot. This was one of my primary decks that I used during that time. The artwork just really encompasses the goddess energy just beautifully. So finally, let's talk about the two newest goddess decks. And the first one is the Goddess Temple. This deck ties the goddess energy into the Wheel of the Year. It follows the Avalonian cycle. And then we have some cards for the masculine energy, for the feminine energy, and then we have transformation cards. I've kept this deck divided up because I'm actually using it for some seasonal Wheel of the Year readings, and it's working beautifully for that. And finally, the last deck that I have been using for deep inner work is the Sacred Mothers and Goddesses Oracle. In the book, there is a spread for every single divine feminine in this deck. And so how I've been working with it is to pull one of these cards, look at the spread, and then pull a tarot deck to actually do the spread to really dive deeper into the message of each goddess. And it's been just absolutely fantastic. One of the decks that I use quite often for just kind of connecting to healing energy is the Angel Blessing cards. This is a vintage copy, and I do believe that these are out of print. I do really like the keywords. The guidebook is quite lovely, and I do dip in and out of it, but for the most part, I really just sink into this absolutely gorgeous artwork and tune into the keywords that are on the cards. I often use this deck with my Mysteries of Mary tarot. Another angel deck that I just can't seem to get rid of in my collection is the Archangel Gabriel Oracle cards. Despite the fact that some of the keywords are quite bizarre, I really enjoy working with this deck. I love the imagery. And as you can probably tell, when it comes to angel decks, I am much more drawn to the Renaissance style artwork. It is definitely a deck that I tune into when I'm feeling like I need some support. So another deck that I tune into for kind of healing and support work is the Mystical Healing Reading cards. I really like the artwork. There are a couple cards that are turned the other way, but the way that I work with is to really only work with one of these oracle cards at a time. I may lay some tarot with it, but for the most part, it's just a one card deal. I definitely work with the guidebook with this deck because I think the guidebook is really wonderful. So another deck that I like to tune into is the Nature's Whisper Oracle. I really like the artwork in this deck. I don't pay quite so much attention to the keywords at the bottom, although they are quite lovely. This for me is a path-working deck that is tied very much into kind of healing and nurturing. And so I definitely use it very specifically in that way. I very rarely do actual readings with it. So a couple of new decks in my collection that I found have been quite healing, nurturing, and supportive are the Senses of the Soul Oracle. It's a deck that I think I will be diving deeper into in terms of working with the structure of it. I have not had a chance to work with it in depth yet, but I feel like this is going to be one that is going to be very nurturing and supportive, and possibly also help with some healing. So another new deck in my collection is the Mindful Living Inspiration cards. This is another deck that I've just gotten into my collection, so I haven't had a chance to really work with it a ton yet. Having looked through it, having done the walkthrough, and having really kind of looked through the journal quite a bit, I do feel like this is going to be a very wonderful deck for kind of support, for healing, and for really kind of tapping into what do you need to support yourself today. And the last deck in this collection is the Secret Language of Light. There's something really kind of powerful about this artwork. And one of the reasons why I bought it is because it is a Denise Jarvie deck, and she is the person who curated the Art of Love Tarot. And I really enjoyed her write-up in that deck. I really enjoyed the way she approached it. And so I wanted to get this one. On the box, it says Transmissions from Your Soul. So I thought this might be a wonderful deck for tapping into that kind of energy. Now let's take a peek at the oracle decks that I use to help me explore the larger energies of the world, where we come from, and how we connect. So the oracle deck that I primarily tap into for that sort of cosmic connection is what I call my Light Seed Oracle, because this is actually the Star Seed Oracle and the Work Your Light Oracle blended together into one deck. And I've kind of curated this into taking those two decks and creating my own sort of deck that really resonates with the way that I kind of experience these cards. On the majority of the cards, I do like the titles and keywords. I do tend to tap into those some, but for me, it's really about, you know, this artwork, which does feel very cosmic. So another combined cosmic deck that I've created using two different oracles and kind of is the counterbalance to what we just looked at is the Blue Messiah reading cards and the Cosmic reading cards. And these both have artwork by the same artist, and I think they work really beautifully together. So I've just combined them into one gorgeous oracle deck. But rather than having that sort of starseed energy, it kind of has a little bit more of that earth child energy to me, of reminding that, you know, coming from the stars, but being grounded in the earth. And I think that that's really beautiful. This to me feels like a wonderful balance to the other deck we just looked at. And speaking of the stars, I have here the Arcana of Astrology by Claire Goodchild that I'm going to be using as my study deck for astrology. I really love the way Claire writes, so I'm really excited to dive into the guidebook. This artwork to me really resonates, and I really love the aesthetic of it. And just in showing my full collection here, I do also have the Arcana of Astrology Indie edition as well. So moving into my nature-based oracle decks, we have the Plant Spirit Oracle. It is very much looking at nature and the connectivity of all things, which I think is really beautiful. I really enjoy working with this deck. I love the artwork. I do not have the larger guidebook. I probably should get it. But I do find that with the keywords on the bottom, that's usually, between that and the beautiful artwork, that's usually all I really need to kind of tap into that sort of nature energy or the message of the card. So one of my favorite nature kind of inspired oracle decks is the Roots and Wings Oracle. I really love the artwork on this deck. I love the white space around it. And it's a very balanced oracle deck. And that's one of the things that I do really appreciate about it. It does have some of the major arcana cards represented, which I think is really wonderful. And it's really interesting when you pair it with tarot and you get, like, say, 2 magicians. So another one of my favorites is the Illuminated Earth Oracle. This is again, another really balanced oracle deck, which I really appreciate. There is a difference between a balanced oracle and an affirmation deck, and I do have several of those as well. And in a more balanced deck, you do get to see those disruptive or challenging aspects of life that are represented in some of these more balanced oracles, which I really do appreciate. I really love the artwork in this deck. So another oracle deck by the same creator is the Faceted Garden Oracle. Whereas I feel the Illuminated Earth is more about the larger, grander outside world, I feel that the Faceted Garden really represents the kind of inner world, the inner landscape of self and of being human. I find that the way they read is very different, and I like having those two energies represented, the kind of larger world and the inner world. So an interesting nature, sort of, more of a landscape-based deck is the Sacred Destiny Oracle. Now, I wasn't sure where to actually put this deck because it does have a bit more of a modern feel to it, but the deck is comprised of landscapes. And I really, really do like the keywords. I like the artwork overall. It's a beautiful deck and I do really enjoy working with it. Next up, we have the Wisdom of the Trees Oracle. And this is the newest nature-inspired deck in my collection. As you can see, it's all still in order because I haven't yet had a chance to work with it. I love tree decks, but I don't need 100 of them. So I have chosen this one to be my main tree deck for the foreseeable future. And I'm passing along some of my other tree decks because I'd like to really just take the time to connect with this one. So moving along, we have the Maiden Oracle. This one could have gone into a couple of different sections because it does have the full major arcana in it as well. But you can see it is very much a botanical inspired deck, but we do have a little bit of a variety of things in this deck going on. So this deck is really interesting because it kind of has a system to it a little bit, and it has some unique cards and structures in it that I do quite enjoy working with. So another botanical oracle, also by the same creator, is the Pythia Botanica. And this one is more of a traditional botanical deck where we have the flower image, we have the type of plant or flower that it is with a keyword. And I love the simple line drawn artwork with just those muted splashes of color. And the keywords are really wonderful, and it does have a nice balance to it as well. So moving along to probably my most used botanical oracle is the Botanical Inspiration cards. Part of this is, again, that vintagey, tea-stained, old book look. The other part of this deck for me is not only the keywords and the quotes that are on it, but the information that's in the guidebook, because it has a little messages section, and I just always resonate with what's written in there. I've never not had one of those messages resonate for me. So another one of my most used botanical oracle decks is the Hedwitch Botanical. And this one is much more modern. It has a lot of white space, and I find that this deck pairs really beautifully. It's also an oracle that I use a lot to create some calm and some space in a really hectic reading, or to use with a tarot deck that has a lot of busy artwork. So another often used botanical oracle in my collection is the Magical Herb Oracle. And this is one of my favorites in terms of its aesthetic. I love the design of this deck. I love the color palette. I like the botanicals being kind of like taped down, and we have the little emblems that relate to the keywords are sort of penciled in to the background, which I think is just really lovely. Next up, we have the Flowers of the Night Oracle. I love these backs. I have edged it in this green, which matches the inside of the box, and that just thrills me. This deck is another really well-balanced oracle. The color palette is just so striking. I love the black backgrounds with the white line work with those pops of color. It's very, very striking. It looks beautiful on the table. But really, I really do like the keywords and the messages that come from this. And finally, we have the newest botanical oracle in my collection, which is How to Be a Wildflower. I love this deck. It has artwork by Katie Daisy. On the one side, we have the flower imagery, and on the other, we have the messages. And I really, really like it. It's very creative. It's very fun. It's very colorful. These all come from, her artwork, her books. It's just fantastic. I love it. I have a plan for this one as well. So still in the nature category, but more in terms of animal cards, we have the Whispers of the Ocean. I really do connect with ocean energy and with sea life. And I love this deck. I love the imagery. I love that it is all ocean animals. We have several whale cards, which makes me happy. And I find that the keywords and the little meanings on the bottom are quite wonderful. And again, it's just beautiful, and it's an ocean deck. Next up, we have the Spirit Animal Oracle. I really like this deck. I find that the keywords and the messages are just spot on, despite the fact that I'm not wild about kind of this adornment that's added to a lot of the animals. Sometimes it's more distracting than others. I do really find that it's a wonderful animal deck. I've gone through several of my animal decks to kind of pare down to the one that I kind of connect with the most, the one that I enjoy working with the most. And the last deck in this collection is the Wild Unknown Animal Spirit. This deck is the complete opposite from the one we just looked at. This one for me is all about the guidebook. And I absolutely love the write-ups in the guidebook. And so I use this kind of as a way to inspire some bibliomancy. But I do like having the cards to have a visual representation of where this energy falls in a tarot reading. And so that's one of the main reasons why I do still use the card. The first deck in this collection is the Earth Wisdom Oracle, which is a newer deck in my collection and one that I am absolutely enjoying. I love the Celtic Druid vibe to this deck, and I do find that the keywords are quite lovely as well. But really for me, it's really about this artwork. It's just stunning, and I really enjoy working with it. It pairs beautifully with a lot of my kind of Celtic, pagan, even witchy decks, and I think it just works beautifully for that. So another oracle that follows kind of along that same lines is the Mists of Avalon Oracle. I love the artwork in this deck. I was looking for an Avalonian oracle for a very long time, and the artwork and some of the other ones just didn't quite connect for me, but this one, I love the artwork. I think it's fantastic. And again, because it is, Avalon, it's very Celtic, it's very Druid, and it's kind of, and magical, of course, in its representation. So moving through my sort of shamanic style decks, the colors in this deck are just absolutely fantastic. I really enjoy the structure of this deck. This deck works wonderfully as a focal point in a reading, and I really enjoy it for that aspect. I use it quite often for that, especially in the sort of autumn months. It tends to be one of the decks that I pull from a lot during that time as well. And I think it's just absolutely gorgeous. Great messages and great keywords as well. So another shamanic oracle with a totally different energy to it is the Shamanic Healing Oracle. And this one has much more of a primitive art style, which I really enjoy about this deck. It's also a very balanced oracle, so we get a lot of sort of those positive, more negative aspects of life, or light and shadow, depending on how you want to look at it. And so I really do enjoy that about it, and I just really love the artwork. So another deck by the same artist with a very shamanic feel is the Empathetic Oracle. While I do find that the artwork is really, really similar to the shamanic healing that we just looked at, this one has its own kind of energy to it, which I do really enjoy. It's kind of a little bit more focused in on feeling and emotion and the aspects of self, where I feel like the shamanic healing is a little bit more of the outer realm. So we kind of have those two energies balanced between these two oracles. Next up, we have the Angels and Ancestors Oracle cards. I love the pairings in this deck. So we have a lot of pairings of masculine and feminine from certain cultures. I do love that we have some older people in this deck as well. One of the things I like about this deck is we do have angels, we have or guardians, ancestors, and then we also have things like animal cards, kind of what I consider like tools and energies. I do have a video on how I work with this deck as well. The next deck is the Mother's Wisdom Oracle. This deck does have a structure as well. We do have, some animals and some places, and it has a very earthy, connected. This one for me is a little bit of a bridge between a shamanic and an ancestral type deck, because I do feel that it has a very ancestral energy to it. But we also have things like, horse and monkey. And so we don't necessarily have just all the mother energy represented through this deck. Up next is the She Who Watches Oracle. Again, another Ellen Lorenzi Prince deck. Again, love the artwork. But to me, this deck does feel like it connects on a more ancestral level. Again, it's just kind of the theme, the idea, and the kind of story behind this deck is really what, for me, connects it back to that ancestral energy. So I really, really enjoyed reading the guidebook and kind of getting to know it on that level. And now I'm excited to spend some time getting to know the cards themselves. So here we have another of my favorite oracles. This is the Divine Muses Oracle. To me, this deck feels like it connects archetypes and ancestral energy throughout time, throughout history. And I really, really enjoy that about it, is to pull all the different energies, archetypes. It works so well on so many different levels, but it really does feel really tied into ancestral energy for me. And the last ancestral oracle that we have to take a look at is the Weaver's Oracle. And this is brand new to my collection. I have looked through it, and that is all I've done because it just arrived. I am really, really excited to be able to get to know this deck and to spend some time with it. It definitely, of course, has an ancestral feel to it, which is why it's in this category. But it's one that I'm really excited to work with really mindfully. And finally, let's take a look at the oracle decks that I use to help me explore the magical as well as the mundane. The first deck in this collection is the Inner Compass Oracle. We do have some retro type imagery, but again, the style is collage, which is a bit more of a modern take on it. So I love this oracle deck. It's one of my favorites, and I love its little pocket size. This is a deck that I sometimes just pull a card from just to pull a card from. I don't necessarily have to do like a whole reading to make use of these cards. I get great messages from it. It's simple, it's fun, but it's actually a great reader as well. So moving along to another collage style oracle, we have the Wild Unknown Archetypes card. Now, this was originally a round deck. I modified it down to make it so that I can actually shuffle and work with this deck. I find that it works really well as kind of a central focus for a tarot reading, and I use it quite often for that. I do use the guidebook with this particular deck because there's a lot of really wonderful write-ups in it. So moving along, we have the Sacred Creators Oracle. This is the indie version, but there is a mass market version out now as well. It really shines as a wrap up to a tarot reading, kind of as in a takeaway message. I use it a lot for that. It also works really well for a focus card in a tarot reading. It's a very well-rounded deck, and it does serve a lot of different purposes in my collection. I can use it for a lot of different things. So another modern oracle deck and a newer one to my collection is the Connected and Free. I really enjoy working with this deck. It has some wonderful cards in it. Again, very balanced, which I really appreciate. And I find it makes a beautiful focal point in a reading. That I kind of found is one of my favorite ways to work with this deck, is to let this be the main focal point and then to lay my tarot cards around it. So it's a beautiful, beautiful deck. This one is what I would consider a true affirmation deck. This is The Universe Has Your Back. I really dig the artwork in this deck, but some of the messages really kind of get on my nerves after a while. There is a lot of references to love. Some of the messages are super wordy. But again, this one makes another wonderful wrap up for a reading. I do have plans for this deck. Let's just say that, because I adore the artwork. And I also have the next iteration of that, which is the Super Attractor. Again, another affirmation deck by the same artist and author team. This one is a little bit better in terms of its phrasing, although some of them are still quite a bit wordy. The other deck is meant kind of more of an affirmation deck, a supportive deck. This one is more about kind of manifestation, which is really cool and interesting. And again, I really dig this artwork. And finally, the last of my modern oracles is the Threadbound Oracle. And I don't know how I missed this one originally, because it's so right up my alley. You know, it's paper and ink. It does have a system within it, which I'm really excited to explore. But at this point, I've really not done anything besides look through it, because it has really just come into my collection. So I'm really excited to work with that one. It's beautiful, it's colorful, it's diverse. It's an oracle with a system, which I do actually love. I have a couple of oracle decks by Claire Goodchild, who's the creator of the Antique Anatomy. This is the Memento Mori. It is a oracle and Lenormand all in one, so it's like an 80+ card deck. I love that this deck has some really interesting keywords. It has a really interesting imagery and cards that we don't often see in oracle decks. So it's definitely a unique creation that I really enjoy working with. So also by the same creator, we have the Oracle of Oddities. I believe this is the second one. It's a very balanced deck in terms of light and shadow, or kind of positive, negative cards. And it's one that I really, really enjoy working with. And I've gotten some really wonderful readings. It's a fantastic one to pair with tarot. I actually keep it with my Memento Mori, because I tend to just kind of mishmash them all together into one gigantic, beautiful oracle deck. So another oracle deck that I feel really captures the balance between light and shadow beautifully is the Oracle of Echoes. And although it's not necessarily a really dark and gothic deck, it's what I would consider probably one of the most balanced oracle decks in my collection. And I think that this one also really ties into not so much the aspect of death, but really the fragility of life. And I think that it's really a beautiful deck to really encapsulate that. Next up, we have the Seasons of the Witch Samhain Oracle. I think that it actually works really well all year round to kind of tap into that Samhain energy and bring it out into other times of the year. And I found that actually this deck works beautifully around the darker new moon, which is also kind of that diving deep into self and the darker aspects of things. And so I think this deck actually works beautifully for that, even when it's not Samhain. And finally, the last deck for the kind of dark and gothic decks is the Literary Witches Oracle. Now this one, I've kind of created a pseudo Lenormand and Oracle out of this particular deck, and that is really how I use it, where I pull one of the literary witches and then I use the witches material cards to actually gain my message from that. I really do enjoy working with this one, particularly around the darker months of the year. The first deck in this collection is the Oracle of the Mystical Moments. I love this deck. I love the artwork. Truth be told, I don't pay any attention to the keywords, but again, it is stepping into this gorgeous, vintage, Victorian, strange dreamscape world. One of the things that I found that this deck is really great for is to pair with a really serious tarot deck, pull a lighter message out of it, or to help you look at that message from a different perspective. And so I really enjoy that about it. Next up, we have the Earthbound Oracle. Not quite as surreal as the Wooden Tarot is, but we do occasionally get some strange surreal imagery in here. I love this Oracle deck. It is very earthy, it is very grounded, but it's also very balanced. It pairs beautifully with so many different decks. It brings a really wonderful balanced energy to a reading, and it creates a wonderful focal point for a tarot reading. So the newest Oracle deck in my collection is the Universal Folk Oracle. This one definitely has a nature and earthy vibe to it, but it also has a bit of a storybook quality to it. This deck is created to be culturally nondescript, so we don't have any specific cultures represented, but you can definitely see that there are some cultural aspects to these cards. Again, that color palette is just fantastic. I love the dark earthy energy that it has and that kind of connection to moon work as well. So that's a look at my entire Oracle collection as of March 2021. Thank you for joining me today. You'll find links for everything featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.